This is the story of Bill Gates, the college dropout who built a software empire, the ruthless monopolist dragged through federal court, and the billionaire who chose to spend his fortune fighting diseases that the world's richest countries had. Chapter 1: The Early Spark. Seattle in October tends to remind you that the rain has opinions. The skies go the color of old pewter. The air carries that particular Pacific Northwest chill that isn't quite cold enough to complain about, but cold enough to make you wish you had complained sooner, and the city settles into itself with a kind of damp, thoughtful quiet. It was into this atmosphere, moody, intelligent, slightly overcast, that William Henry Gates III arrived on October 28, 1955, which in hindsight seems exactly right. He fit the weather. His father, Bill Gates Sr., was a man of considerable presence, a prominent Seattle attorney with a handshake that could fill a room and a mind that could dissect a contract the way a surgeon dissects a problem, cleanly, efficiently, without sentiment. His mother, Mary Maxwell Gates, was no less formidable. A civic leader of real standing, she served on boards, organized committees, and moved through Seattle society with the particular grace of someone who genuinely wanted things to go better for people and also happened to be very good at making that happen. Together, they formed the kind of household where achievement wasn't exactly pressure. It was just the wallpaper. It was ambient. It was in the air along with the rain. Into this world came young Bill, the middle child, sandwiched between sisters Christiane and Libby, and from the very beginning the family noticed something was different about him. Not unusual in a worrying way, unusual in a what on earth is going on way. He read everything. That's the only way to say it. He didn't read like other children read, which is to say selectively and under mild parental duress. He read the way some people breathe, constantly, compulsively, as though something bad might happen if he stopped. The family encyclopedia set, which most households kept around for decoration and the occasional school project, Bill treated as a personal challenge. He went through it, systematically. All of it. He reportedly had entire sections memorized, which is the kind of thing that is extremely impressive and also slightly unnerving to encounter at a dinner table when you are 8 years old and just trying to finish your peas. His parents watched this with a mixture of admiration and something approaching the faint existential unease of people who suspect they may have produced something they don't entirely know how to categorize. They were achievers themselves. They valued intellect, but Bill seemed to operate on a frequency slightly above the standard register, like a radio picking up a station nobody else could quite tune into. He asked questions constantly. Not the polite conversational questions that children deploy to seem interested, but the drilling, iterative, why does that lead to that questions that exhaust adults and delight only the very patient or the very philosophically inclined. Why was his engine. It never seemed to run out of fuel. He wanted to understand not just what something was, but how it worked, why it worked that way, whether it had to work that way, and what would happen if it didn't. Teachers found him, depending on the teacher, either wonderfully stimulating or absolutely exhausting, which is the eternal fate of the genuinely curious. His family, to their great credit, didn't try to sand the edges off him. They let the boy be the boy. They enrolled him at Lakeside School, a private preparatory school in Seattle with a reputation for academic rigor, where the strange intensity of young Bill Gates would at least be among peers who could, if not always keep up with him, at least not be completely left in the dust. His parents also signed the family up for a summer camp program at the YMCA, which included something called the Delphi program, a kind of structured intellectual competition for kids, and Bill, to the surprise of no one who knew him, loved every minute of it. At home, the Gates family had a tradition of competitive games at the dinner table, board games, card games, trivia contests, and these were taken seriously. Not cruelly seriously, but genuinely seriously, in the way that a family of people who care deeply about thinking treats the act of playing as a small arena where ideas and strategies and wit all had a chance to square off. Bill thrived in this environment. He was competitive in a way that felt almost physical, like the need to win wasn't vanity but something structural, something woven into how he was built. He was also, by accounts from those years, sometimes lonely in the way that very bright children can be lonely. not for lack of people around them, but for lack of people who are quite on the same page. There is a specific kind of isolation that comes from seeing connections and patterns that others don't see, from caring intensely about questions that most people around you haven't thought to ask. Bill was not isolated in any dramatic cinematic way. He had friends, he had family who loved him, but somewhere inside that voracious, restless mind, there was probably a small, quiet ache for the thing that would finally match his speed, for the puzzle big enough to hold him. He didn't know yet what it was. In the mid-1960s, in a comfortable house in Seattle, with his encyclopedia and his dinner table chess and his bottomless appetite for knowing things, the future was still just the future. Enormous, unresolved, waiting. He was a boy in a raincoat, essentially, staring at a horizon he couldn't name but couldn't stop looking at. His mother, who understood people in that deep, practical way of someone who had spent a lifetime in civic life, once said simply that Bill had always been intense. The word she used was almost gentle, the way you describe a weather system as interesting. But intensity was the right word. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't arrogance, at least not yet. It was something closer to necessity, a sense that the ordinary pace of things was perpetually, slightly, maddeningly too slow for what was happening inside his head. Mary Gates was right, and she was also, without knowing exactly how or when or in what extraordinary form it would eventually arrive, watching something rare happen in real time, a child becoming the person who would one day reshape the world, one restless, encyclopedic, rain-soaked question at a time. The ordinary life was already, quietly, losing the battle. Chapter 2. The Machine That Mesmerized. The terminal did not look like destiny. It sat in a room at the lakeside school looking roughly like an oversized typewriter that had developed ambitions, a gray, humming, faintly industrial thing connected by telephone line to a mainframe computer miles away. Other students walked past it with polite curiosity, the way you might glance at a fire extinguisher. Interesting, vaguely purposeful, not really your problem. Bill Gates was 13 years old when he sat down in front of it, and he did not get up the same person. This was 1968, and Lakeside School, the elite Seattle prep school where Gates was enrolled, had just made a decision that would, in retrospect, look either prescient or accidental depending on your generosity. The Lakeside Mothers Club had raised enough money through a rummage sale to rent time on a General Electric computer accessed through a teletype terminal installed at the school. The idea was to let the boys experiment, to poke at it, to learn something loosely and see what happened. What happened was Bill Gates. He came to that terminal with the same restless hunger he had brought to encyclopedias and board games and any system of rules he could study until the rules became obvious to him. But this was different. This was not knowledge to be memorized. It was a conversation to be had. You typed something and the machine responded. You made an error and it told you so without embarrassment or cruelty. You found the right sequence and it executed exactly what you intended, no more and no less. For a boy who had spent years feeling that his brain operated at a frequency slightly out of sync with the world around him, the computer was almost startlingly compatible. He thought in its language before he had even properly learned it. Paul Allen was there too, a gangly, quiet boy 2 years older than Gates, already obsessive about technology in the way that would define his whole life. The two of them were not an obvious pair at first glance. Allen was shy and methodical. Gates was loud, argumentative, so brimming with competitive energy that he could make a casual game of Monopoly feel like a legal deposition. But around the terminal they became something else. Collaborators locked inside a shared obsession so complete that the rest of the school grew faintly distant, like noise through a closed door. They read everything they could find about programming, they pored over the manuals, they argued about code the way other boys argued about baseball statistics, and the arguments had a similar emotional pitch, personal, heated, oddly joyful. Gates had always loved to win, but what he discovered in programming was something better than winning. It was building. Every program that ran correctly was a small proof that the universe could be made to cooperate. The school's computer time was rationed, of course, because computer time cost real money and 13-year-olds were not exactly the primary audience. This did not stop them. Gates and Allen found workarounds, lobbied for more access, traded favors for terminal time, and when all else failed, they simply stayed. They skipped classes with the serene confidence of people who have privately concluded that the class is less interesting than whatever they are doing instead. They stayed so late that the janitors began to recognize them. They were not troubled students. They were, in the specific and slightly maddening way of certain driven teenagers, students who had located a higher priority and were pursuing it with an efficiency that left no room for algebra. There were consequences, naturally. Teachers noticed absences. Parents received calls. Gates would later describe this period with a kind of fond half-apology, the way adults talk about choices that were clearly reckless and clearly correct at the same time. His parents, his father the lawyer, his mother the civic pillar, were not oblivious. They saw a son who was brilliant and peculiar and had found something that consumed him entirely. They worried the way parents worry, imperfectly, and out of love. But Gates himself was not worried. He was lit up. He was, for the first time in his young life, exactly where he was supposed to be. The bugs, it should be said, were educational in the truest and most humbling sense. Programming in those early days was not the smooth, tutorial-assisted experience available today. It was you, a stack of manuals, a machine that would answer you in cryptic error messages, and the particular quiet of a room where everyone else had gone home. A misplaced character could break everything. A loop that didn't terminate correctly would send the program spinning into digital oblivion while the clock ticked and the terminal time drained away. Gates would discover an error at the worst possible moment, feel the flash of frustration that would become famous in later years, and then, and this was the crucial part, sit back down and find the mistake. He always found the mistake. There was a particular period when the boys discovered they could exploit a bug in the operating system to gain free computer time from a company called Computer Center Corporation, known as C-Cubed, which had set up a local time-sharing service. They were caught. They were briefly banned. And then in one of those only in hindsight does this seem inevitable moments, C-Cubed offered them free computer time in exchange for finding more bugs. The boys who had broken the rules became more or less immediately the consultants. Gates was 15. What he was learning went deeper than code. He was learning how systems worked, how they failed, how to read the logic underneath the logic. He was learning that computers were not magic. They were extraordinarily precise, and that precision was something he could meet. He was also learning, perhaps without fully naming it yet, that he had a gift. Not the gift of ease, but the harder and more durable gift of focused obsession. He could outwork almost anyone. He could sit with a problem until the problem gave way. Allen, watching this, understood something that others didn't yet. He would later describe the young Gates as someone who had a kind of ferocity about computation, not just enthusiasm, but something closer to need. The machine filled a space in Gates that had always been there, restless and reaching. By the time he was 16, Gates had already written a program to schedule Lakeside's classes, had charged money for software, and had begun thinking about computing not as a hobby but as something that might actually run the world someday. That last idea was not yet formed clearly enough to be called a plan. It was more like a hunch, or a feeling at the edge of a feeling, the sense that the world did not yet know what it had in this technology, but that he did. He was a teenager in a prep school in Seattle, staying too late in a room full of humming machines, and he was, without fully understanding it yet, already becoming who he would be. Chapter 3: Harvard and the Gamble. Picture the most intellectually competitive place you have ever been in your life. A seminar room, maybe, or a championship debate, or that one Thanksgiving dinner where your uncle, who never shuts up, actually had a point. Now multiply that by several hundred, put it in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and charge your parents an alarming amount of money for the privilege. That was Harvard in the fall of 1973, and somewhere inside its hallowed, slightly damp brick corridors was an 18-year-old from Seattle who had placed in the top handful of students in the entire country on the math SAT, and who was now discovering, perhaps for the first time, that he had actual competition. Bill Gates loved it. He signed up for Math 55, which is Harvard's way of politely asking students whether they are truly serious about mathematics or merely flirting with it. The course was, and remains, legendary for breaking spirits the way a long hike breaks cheap shoes. Gates thrived. He stayed up until 4 in the morning working through proofs, then wandered into breakfast looking, by most accounts, like a person who had survived something. He played poker with genuine cunning, studying odds and tells with the same intensity other students applied to their coursework. He argued, debated, charmed, and irritated people in roughly equal measure. By any reasonable measure, Bill Gates was doing exactly what Harvard wanted him to do, except that his mind kept wandering. It drifted, reliably and helplessly, back to computers, back to the feeling he had known since he was 13, that sensation of total absorption, of a mind finally running at the speed it actually wanted to run. He and his old friend Paul Allen had stayed close despite living in different cities, and Allen had taken a programming job in Boston, which meant the two of them could meet up and talk, the way they always talked, in long breathless spirals about what machines might someday do. Harvard had a computer lab, and Gates used it the way some students use a therapist, constantly, and for problems that were fundamentally unresolvable but satisfying to examine anyway. The tension was real, and he felt it. Here was one of the greatest universities in the world, offering him access to some of the finest minds of the century, and he was restless. Not ungrateful exactly, but the sensation was something like sitting in a very elegant restaurant and realizing, halfway through the meal, that you already know exactly what you want to cook for the rest of your life. Then came the magazine. In January of 1975, Paul Allen walked into Gates's life holding a copy of Popular Electronics with the enthusiasm of a man who has just seen the future printed on glossy paper. The cover featured the Altair 8800, a small, boxy microcomputer being sold as a kit by a company in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It cost $397, which was a meaningful sum at the time. It had no software. It could not really do anything yet, in the way that a stage with no actors cannot really do anything yet, but it existed. A real computer, not a university mainframe that cost as much as a house, sitting right there on the cover of a hobbyist magazine. Gates looked at it and felt something shift. He would later describe the moment as a kind of alarm going off, the clear and unambiguous sense that history had just knocked on the door and was not willing to wait in the hallway. The future, he realized, was not arriving on the schedule he had imagined. It was arriving now, this month, on this magazine cover, and if he did not move immediately, someone else would be standing at the door when it opened. He and Allen hatched a plan with the speed of people who have been quietly rehearsing a plan for years without quite admitting it. They would contact MIT-CS, the company behind the Altair, and offer them something the machine desperately needed, a version of BASIC, the programming language, adapted to run on it. The remarkable detail, the part that makes this either inspiring or quietly terrifying depending on your disposition, is that they did not yet have such a thing. They called, told the company they had it, and then sat down to build it as fast as humanly possible. This is sometimes described as confidence. It was also, let's be honest, a spectacular bluff. Gates wrote code. Allen worked on a simulator so they could test the program without actually owning an Altair. They barely slept. They skipped things that Harvard undergraduates are theoretically supposed to attend, like classes. When Allen finally flew to Albuquerque to demonstrate the software, running it for the first time on a real Altair machine because they had not tested it on the actual hardware before that moment, it worked. It ran. The number it printed to the screen was correct. Allen walked out into the New Mexico sunshine and probably needed to sit down. Not long after, Gates made the decision that would define everything. He left Harvard. He did not finish his degree. He packed up whatever a 20-year-old packs when he is leaving one of the world's great universities to start a company in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is to say not much, and he went. His parents were not enthusiastic. His mother, Mary, had opinions about this, and she was not a woman who kept opinions to herself. His father had built a life on credentials and institutions and the slow accumulation of professional gravity. The idea of their son walking away from Harvard struck them the way it would strike most reasonable people, as a gamble that made the poker games back in the dorm look like child's play. Gates heard them out. He understood their concern. He left anyway. It is worth pausing here, before the mythology fully calcifies, to sit with that moment. He was 19 years old. He was walking away from a degree that would have opened any door he ever wanted to walk through. He was betting on a vision of personal computing that most people, smart, reasonable, well-informed people, thought was somewhere between premature and delusional. The idea that ordinary individuals would one day own and use computers the way they owned and used televisions was, in 1975, not an obvious prediction. It was an act of imagination so far out ahead of consensus reality that it required a specific kind of stubbornness to hold on to it. Gates held on to it. He and Allen named their partnership Microsoft, a compound of microcomputer and software, and set up shop in Albuquerque, a city neither of them had any particular attachment to, drawn there entirely by the company whose magazine cover had changed the direction of both their lives. The offices were modest. The staff was small. The average age of everyone involved would not have impressed a banker. But they were there, and they were building, and somewhere underneath all the ambition and the code and the slightly feverish energy of two young men who had decided to bet on themselves against all sensible advice, there was something that felt, to Bill Gates at least, unmistakably right. Chapter 4. The Deal That Built an Empire. The phone call came on a Thursday, and it almost went to the wrong company. That detail, small and slightly absurd, contains the entire shape of what followed. In the summer of 1980, representatives from IBM, the most powerful technology company on Earth, the kind of institution that could make or unmake an industry with a single memo, contacted a small software firm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, looking for an operating system to power a new personal computer they were building in secret. Microsoft, at the time, was not exactly a household name. It had about 40 employees, revenues somewhere in the neighborhood of modest, and no operating system whatsoever. IBM had initially reached out to another company entirely. Fate, apparently, had a scheduling conflict. Gates, 24 years old and already constitutionally incapable of passing up a large opportunity, did not let the confusion go to waste. The meeting was the kind that required a suit, which was already a clue that something serious was happening. Gates reportedly borrowed one. Whether that story is entirely true or has been polished by retelling into something more cinematic is hard to say, but it has the ring of emotional truth. Here was a young man still close enough to his student years that formal clothing felt like a costume, walking into a negotiation that would define the next 2 decades of computing. He sat across from IBM's team and, by most accounts, radiated a confidence that his inventory of products did not quite justify. IBM wanted an operating system. Microsoft did not have one. Gates said yes anyway. This is the part of the story that business school professors love, because it illustrates something they struggle to teach: the willingness to close a deal for a thing you do not yet possess and then immediately go figure out how to possess it. Some people call this visionary, others call it a spectacular nerve. The important thing is that it worked. What Gates did next was move fast in the unglamorous way that actual progress usually requires. He learned that a programmer in Seattle named Tim Patterson had built a functional operating system, a workmanlike piece of software called QDOS, which stood, with a certain candid modesty, for Quick and Dirty Operating System. Gates acquired it for roughly $50,000, a sum that would become one of the most lopsided transactions in the history of commerce. Patterson has spoken about it over the years with understandable complexity of feeling. He built something real and useful, sold it at what seemed like a fair price, and then watched the world reorganize itself around what became of his work. History is sometimes generous and sometimes just efficient. Microsoft licensed the renamed system, now MS-DOS, to IBM, and here is where Gates demonstrated that he understood something profound about the future that IBM, for all its size and experience, did not yet see clearly. He retained the rights to license MS-DOS to other manufacturers. IBM, eager to move quickly and perhaps too confident in the strength of its own brand, accepted these terms. They believed their hardware would be the moat. Gates believed the software would be. He was right in a way that compounded annually for the next 15 years. IBM's PC launched in 1981 and sold extraordinarily well, which was wonderful for IBM and even more wonderful for Microsoft. But the architecture of the IBM PC was not difficult to replicate. Within a couple of years, other manufacturers, Compaq leading the charge, were building compatible machines. Clone after clone arrived on the market, each one cheaper and more accessible than the last. The personal computer stopped being a prestige item and started becoming furniture, and every single one of those machines needed an operating system. Every single one of them ran MS-DOS. Gates had not merely sold a product, he had planted a flag in the substrate of an entire industry. There is something almost vertiginous about tracing this forward. The decision to retain licensing rights, made in a negotiation between a borrowed suit and a corporate giant, built on a system purchased for $50,000, eventually installed Microsoft software on hundreds of millions of computers. It funded the development of Windows. It gave Gates the platform and the capital to extend Microsoft's reach into nearly every corner of the software world. A single clause in a contract, essentially, became the load-bearing wall of the personal computing revolution. But it would be too easy, and a little dishonest, to tell this story as though Gates simply foresaw everything and executed a flawless plan. He was also navigating a period of real uncertainty, building a company in real time, managing engineers and deadlines in a market that was changing shape faster than anyone could reliably predict. The version of Bill Gates that exists in retrospect, the one who knew exactly what he was doing at every moment, is partially a construction of outcome. In the middle of it, there was improvisation, there was pressure, there were moments when the right move was not obvious and he made a call and it happened to be correct. What was genuine was his grasp of leverage. He understood, with a clarity unusual in someone his age, that the person who owns the platform owns the game. Hardware would commoditize, machines would get cheaper and faster and interchangeable, but the software that told the hardware what to do, that was where the durable power lived. IBM saw a product. Gates saw an ecosystem. The difference between those two visions is essentially the difference between a company that peaked in the early 1980s and one that became the most valuable corporation on Earth. By the mid-1980s, Microsoft had moved its headquarters back to the Seattle area, to a campus in Redmond that would grow and grow until it looked less like a software company and more like a small municipality with unusually good benefits. The scrappy outfit that had once operated out of Albuquerque, surviving on ambition and the occasional borrowed suit, had become something else entirely. It had become infrastructure, and it had gotten there on the back of a deal that almost didn't happen, built on a product Gates didn't have, anchored by a licensing clause that changed the world. All because a phone call went to the right place at the right time, and a 24-year-old said yes before he had any particular reason to. Chapter 5. Windows to the World. Imagine trying to explain a graphical user interface to someone in 1983. You sit them down, you say, instead of typing arcane commands into a blinking cursor, you simply point at a little picture on the screen and click. They stare at you. They ask if you are feeling all right. Then they go back to their spreadsheet, which they have been operating by memorizing roughly 40 keyboard shortcuts they found in a laminated card taped to their monitor. This was the world Microsoft was trying to change, and it was a world that for a while was not entirely sure it wanted changing. Bill Gates was sure, though. He was almost always sure, which was both his most useful quality and the one that made working for him resemble, by most accounts, a particularly rigorous graduate seminar run by someone who had not slept and did not intend to. Microsoft had watched Apple's Macintosh arrive in 1984 with its friendly icons and its mouse, and Gates understood immediately what the image meant. The future of computing was visual, intuitive, and critically enormous. The question was not whether the world would eventually want computers that behaved this way. The question was who would put that experience in front of the most people. Apple had built a beautiful closed garden. Gates wanted to build the road that led everywhere. Windows 1.0 shipped in 1985 to reviews that could be charitably described as underwhelmed. It was slow, it was clunky, and it still required MS-DOS humming underneath it like an anxious engine. The software press greeted it with the enthusiasm one reserves for a party where the food was fine but the music stopped early. Gates took the criticism seriously, which for him meant taking it almost personally, which meant that the people working on the next version took it seriously too, whether they liked it or not. The development culture inside Microsoft in those years was, depending on your constitution, either electrifying or terrifying. Gates had a habit of wandering the halls, sitting in on code reviews and delivering his verdict in a voice that carried. If the work was bad, he said so directly, sometimes memorably, sometimes in terms that people quoted to each other for years afterward, the way soldiers quote battles. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," was not, around Microsoft's offices, a conversation ender. It was an invitation to try harder. The engineers who thrived there were the ones who could argue back, who could show their work, who could sit across from Bill Gates while he dismantled their logic and come back the next morning with something better. What this pressure produced, over years of iteration and stubbornness, was Windows 3.0 in 1990, and suddenly the critics had to recalibrate. 3 million copies sold in the first year, then Windows 3.1 in 1992, and the numbers climbed further. Businesses started standardizing on it, office managers started ordering it. The personal computer was quietly sliding out of the realm of the technically adventurous and into ordinary life, onto the desks of accountants and teachers and small business owners who had no idea what a command line was and no particular desire to find out. Gates pushed constantly, restlessly, reading everything, absorbing technical reports and market analyses and competitor data with an appetite that startled even his own lieutenants. He wrote long, detailed memos, sometimes called Think Weeks documents, that mapped the landscape of technology years ahead and demanded Microsoft position itself accordingly. He was not simply reacting to where the industry was going, he was attempting with some success to decide where it would go. There were personal costs tucked inside that relentlessness, costs that were quieter than the public image suggested. He was famously difficult to be around when he was locked onto a problem, present in body but somewhere else entirely, running calculations in a mind that never quite powered down. He worked hours that made the concept of weekends seem quaint. The company he was building was also, in some ways, the only life he was living, and the line between that being a triumph and a loss was not always easy to draw. Then came Windows 95, and subtlety went out the window entirely. The launch on August 24, 1995, was unlike anything the technology industry had ever staged. Microsoft partnered with the Rolling Stones to license Start Me Up as the campaign's anthem, which was either inspired or audacious or both, depending on how you felt about operating systems being marketed like arena tours. In Times Square, a banner the height of a building unfurled. In Sydney, the sails of the Opera House were lit up in Microsoft's colors. Stores across America opened at midnight, and people actually stood in line in the dark, clutching pre-orders to buy software. Software. The people waiting were not all engineers or hobbyists. There were retired couples. There were teenagers. There were people who couldn't have told you the difference between RAM and a floppy disk, but who understood, somehow, that something significant was happening and they wanted to be part of it. Gates appeared at the launch events with an energy that bordered on giddy, and it seemed genuine because it was. This was the validation of a decade of conviction. Windows 95 sold 7 million copies in its first 5 weeks. It introduced the Start menu, which would become so deeply embedded in the muscle memory of the human race that when Microsoft eventually tried to remove it 17 years later, the backlash was operatic. It was the moment the personal computer stopped being a device and became infrastructure. Invisible, assumed, woven into the routines of daily life the way electricity had been woven in a generation before. There is a particular kind of victory that is hard to describe because it doesn't feel like a single moment. It accumulates. It is the secretary in Ohio learning to save a file. It is the student in Portugal formatting a resume. It is the small business owner in Malaysia sending her first email. None of those people were thinking about Bill Gates. They were just using a computer the way you use a light switch without thinking about the grid behind the wall. That invisibility was, in its way, the whole point. Gates had spent more than a decade arguing that the computer should be for everyone, that the barrier between the machine and the person ought to dissolve until there was barely a barrier at all. By the mid-1990s, he had come closer to winning that argument than perhaps even he had fully anticipated. The company he ran was now a juggernaut, and the man himself had become something larger than a businessman, a figure who seemed, from the outside, to have willed a particular version of the future into existence through sheer refusal to accept any other version. He had not just built a company, he had rewired, quietly and then all at once, the daily texture of modern life. Chapter 6. The Richest Man on Earth. There is a specific kind of vertigo that arrives when Forbes publishes your net worth and the number has more commas in it than most people have birthdays. Bill Gates hit that altitude in 1995 and he kept climbing. By the middle of that decade, he had crossed into territory that required a new vocabulary. Not millions, not even billions in a way that felt real, but a personal fortune that bobbed between $40 and $60 billion depending on what the market had for breakfast. He was, by every credible measure, the richest human being on the planet Earth. It was, depending on your point of view, either the most inspiring story in American capitalism or a terrifying demonstration of how much gravity a single mind could accumulate. The magazine covers came in waves: Time, Fortune, Newsweek. There was his face, those wire-rimmed glasses, that slightly bewildered smile that somehow conveyed both shy kid and sovereign simultaneously. Journalists stationed themselves outside Microsoft's campus in Redmond, Washington, as if proximity to the buildings might yield some clue about where the whole thing was going next. When Gates spoke publicly about technology, about the internet, about where the next 10 years would land, analysts and investors and entrepreneurs hunched forward in their chairs like students who suspected the exam question was hidden inside the lecture. His 1996 essay declaring that content is king was printed, debated, and laminated inside media boardrooms for years. The man had become a kind of oracle, and people treated his offhand remarks the way meteorologists treat barometric pressure, as serious data about what was coming. What was quietly remarkable to those paying close attention was how uncomfortable Gates often seemed with the theater of celebrity. He was not built for the red carpet. He could demolish an opponent in a technical argument without breaking a sweat, but watching him navigate a soft-focused television interview was a bit like watching a chess grandmaster asked to perform a magic trick. The skills didn't transfer, and everyone could tell. He rocked slightly in chairs, he blinked too fast during pauses, he would answer a simple question about his favorite movie and somehow steer the conversation back to processor speed. The richest man on earth, and he would have traded the cover of Time for an interesting problem and a whiteboard. At home in his colossal house on the shores of Lake Washington, a property so large it had its own name, Xanadu 2.0, which Gates had supposedly borrowed from the Citizen Kane reference and then immediately made ironic by filling it with serious technology. He had some of the trappings wealth provides and some of the trappings it doesn't. He met Melinda French, a Microsoft product manager with a sharp mind and no interest in being outshone, and married her in 1994 on a golf course in Hawaii that he had rented in its entirety for the occasion, because at a certain level of fortune, privacy becomes something you have to purchase outright. Their daughter Jennifer was born in 1996. Gates, by multiple accounts, would come home and try, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to be a person rather than a symbol. He still drove himself to work. He ate McDonald's cheeseburgers with the devotion of a man who had decided that some pleasures were non-negotiable regardless of net worth. But the scrutiny was sharpening. Every empire large enough casts a shadow large enough for people to start asking what's living in it. By the mid-1990s, Microsoft's dominance wasn't just impressive. It was starting to feel, to its competitors and to regulators in Washington, D.C., like something closer to a siege. The company's market share in operating systems was so complete that Windows had become a synonym for computer in the way Kleenex stands in for tissue. Microsoft had a gift for acquiring or building products in adjacent markets, word processors, spreadsheets, web browsers, and then folding them into the Windows ecosystem in ways that made it very difficult for standalone competitors to breathe. Netscape was breathing for a while. The web browser company had a product, Navigator, that was legitimately excellent and legitimately popular in the early days of the Internet's explosion. But when Microsoft bundled its own browser, Internet Explorer, directly into Windows at no additional charge, Netscape found itself in the position of a restaurant next to a grocery store that was handing out free sandwiches. You couldn't compete with free, especially not when free came pre-installed on 90% of the computers in the world. Critics called it predatory. Microsoft's lawyers called it innovation. The debate was genuinely interesting legally and philosophically, but it was also very expensive for everyone involved and would eventually produce a courtroom reckoning that Gates did not enjoy in the slightest. For now, though, in the mid-90s, the regulatory machinery was grinding toward him slowly, and the company kept rolling. Windows 95 had launched in August of 1995 with a marketing spectacle that rented the Empire State Building, licensed the Rolling Stones' Start Me Up for an amount of money the Stones presumably enjoyed, and attracted the kind of media coverage normally reserved for natural disasters and major elections. The product sold 7 million copies in its first 5 weeks. 7 million. People lined up at midnight outside electronics stores to buy software, which, if you stop to think about it, is one of the more remarkable sentences in the history of commerce. Yet Gates was self-aware enough to recognize that success on this scale changed the nature of the game. He wrote a memo in 1995 called the Internet Tidal Wave, an internal document that acknowledged with startling frankness that Microsoft had underestimated the Internet and needed to redirect its entire organizational energy toward catching up. That memo is still taught in business schools. What it revealed wasn't a man drunk on his own dominance, but a man terrified of missing what came next, who understood that yesterday's monopoly could become tomorrow's cautionary tale in the time it takes a browser to load a page. The wealth was real, the power was real, and the risks compounding on the horizon were real. For the moment, though, the world mostly saw the glossy version: Gates on magazine covers, Gates at the World Economic Forum, Gates accepting honorary degrees from universities that had once accepted his tuition before he stopped coming to class. He was the American dream in glasses, the proof that a kid who loved computers could end up running the world. What the covers couldn't quite capture, because covers by nature flatten things, was that the man behind the legend was increasingly aware that running the world came with a ledger and that the debits had barely started arriving. Chapter 7. The Battle in Court. The deposition tape was supposed to be boring. Legal proceedings usually are. A procedural formality, a gray ritual of objections and clarifications tucked away in some conference room. Nobody expected it to become appointment television, but there was Bill Gates, the most powerful figure in American technology, sitting across from a lawyer named David Boies, and something had gone profoundly, almost comically wrong. Gates blinked. He paused for what felt like geologic stretches of time before answering basic questions. He challenged the meaning of words like concerned and we and compete, as if the English language itself had come under dispute. At one point, when shown an email he had personally written, he appeared to struggle with whether it meant what it plainly said. The courtroom journalists who watched the tapes later described a man who seemed to be defusing a bomb with his eyelids, very slowly, one blink at a time. The United States Department of Justice had filed its landmark antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft in May of 1998, and if you wanted to understand why, you had to understand Netscape. Netscape's Navigator browser had, for a brief and dazzling moment, looked like the future. It was fast, it was popular, and it had the audacity to make the underlying operating system, meaning Windows, meaning Microsoft, feel almost irrelevant. If the browser became the real platform for computing, then Gates's empire rested on shifting sand. Microsoft could not let that stand, and so it did not. The company bundled its own Internet Explorer browser directly into Windows, effectively making Navigator redundant by making it unavailable to the vast majority of computer users. The message was simple: you want Windows, you get our browser. You don't get a choice. Choice is for people who aren't us. The DOJ, led by Attorney General Janet Reno and backed by 20 state attorneys general, saw this not as shrewd business but as a stranglehold. The accusation was that Microsoft had used its monopoly position over PC operating systems to illegally crush competition in the browser market, and in doing so had kneecapped innovation across the entire industry. The suit landed like a thunderclap. This was not some regional regulatory squabble. This was the federal government looking at the most successful software company in history and saying, in plain language, you have gone too far. Gates, for his part, seemed to arrive at the deposition in a mood best described as philosophically resistant. His legal team had presumably coached him on the standard survival tactics: answer narrowly, stay calm, show nothing. But Gates had spent his entire adult life being the smartest person in whatever room he entered, and a conference room full of lawyers was still a room. The result was a performance that managed to be simultaneously overprepared and wildly counterproductive. He argued about verb tenses. He requested definitions of simple nouns. He expressed elaborate uncertainty about emails that bore his own name in the sender field. Boys who had the unhurried confidence of a man who knew exactly where every question was going, let the pauses breathe. He let the jury of public opinion do its own arithmetic. Clips from the deposition were played in open court. Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson, a no-nonsense federal jurist who had seen his share of corporate theatrics, watched them with an expression that journalists covering the trial described as somewhere between puzzled and pained. What was emerging was not just a legal case but an anatomy, a detailed, unflattering cross-section of Microsoft's internal culture. Internal emails entered into evidence revealed executives discussing how to cut off Netscape's air supply, how to use Windows as a weapon, how to neutralize threats not by building better products but by leveraging sheer market dominance. The language was blunt to the point of being almost helpful to the prosecution. The trial became a kind of national seminar on power. Technology reporters who had spent years writing glowing profiles of the Redmond giant now found themselves transcribing evidence of behavior that looked, in a courtroom light, considerably less visionary. The question the case posed was genuinely interesting. At what point does winning become something else? At what point does a company stop competing and start simply occupying? Microsoft's defenders argued that bundling a browser with an operating system was a feature, not a crime, that integration was innovation. The government argued that when the company doing the integrating controls 90% of the market, the word competition becomes something of a fiction. In November 1999, Judge Jackson issued his findings of fact. His verdict was unambiguous. Microsoft was a monopoly, and it had used that monopoly to harm competition. The following June, he ordered the company broken in two, one entity for operating systems, one for other software products. It was a seismic ruling. The remedy, if it held, would have restructured the entire technology industry. It did not hold. An appeals court overturned the breakup order, found that Judge Jackson had compromised his impartiality by giving unauthorized interviews during the proceedings, and sent the case to a new judge. Microsoft ultimately settled with the DOJ in 2001, agreeing to share its programming interfaces with third-party companies but avoiding dismemberment entirely. The company survived, the empire held, but something had shifted that could not be unshifted. Gates had stood in the full glare of public scrutiny and come away diminished in a way that no stock price or earnings report could quantify. The image of him in that deposition, defensive, evasive, almost petulant, lodged itself in the public imagination alongside all the other images: the young prodigy, the visionary entrepreneur, the richest man alive. Now there was a new panel in the portrait, and it was not flattering. He had spent decades projecting total confidence, and total confidence, it turned out, looks very different when you are under oath. Those close to him noticed changes in the years that followed, a quieter quality, a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than argue his way out of it. The trial had not broken him, not even close, but it had introduced him to something most intensely driven people spend their whole lives outrunning: the experience of being genuinely publicly wrong. Not wrong in a calculation, not wrong in a product cycle, wrong in a way that required acknowledgement, reflection, and something resembling humility. He was still one of the most powerful people on Earth. The software still ran on nearly every machine on the planet. None of that had changed. But Bill Gates, who had always understood power as something you accumulate and deploy, was beginning quietly to understand it as something you are also accountable for, and that understanding, more than any court ruling, would set the course for everything that came next. Chapter 8. A New Mission Begins. Somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa in the year 2000, a child died of malaria every 30 seconds, not metaphorically, not approximately, clinically, statistically, with the cold regularity of a metronome. Most of the world was not watching. Bill Gates had just started to. Stepping down as Microsoft's CEO that January, Gates found himself in the strange position of being one of the most powerful people on Earth with, suddenly, a little time to think. The company he had built from a college dropout's fever dream was now a colossus. It didn't exactly need him hovering over its shoulder anymore. What it needed, and what Gates needed, was a different chapter entirely. He and Melinda had been talking for years about the responsibility that came strapped to extraordinary wealth, the kind of conversations that begin earnestly at dinner and gradually become something more serious, more urgent, more impossible to ignore. In January 2000, they stopped talking and started doing. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation launched with an endowment that made journalists physically pause mid-sentence to do the math. Tens of billions of dollars committed to global health and the reduction of poverty, numbers so large they bent the mind a little. Warren Buffett would later add billions more in what became one of the most consequential acts of private philanthropy in history. But at the start, the foundation was still, in its own way, a startup. A small office, a big mission, and a man who had never taken a course in public health trying to figure out what the world actually needed. What happened next reveals something essential about Bill Gates that his years in software had already suggested but never quite proved. He doesn't do anything halfway. Not software, not lawsuits, not personal reinvention. He dove into global health data the way a person drowns, fully, immediately, with no apparent concern for air. He read epidemiology papers over breakfast. He studied disease burden statistics the way he had once pored over programming manuals. He had a habit, friends and colleagues noted, of arriving at meetings having already absorbed more background material than the experts presenting it, which was both impressive and, for the experts, slightly unnerving. The diseases he and Melinda chose to focus on shared a grim common trait. They killed overwhelmingly poor people in overwhelmingly poor countries, which meant they attracted overwhelmingly little attention from wealthy governments and pharmaceutical companies. Malaria had largely been conquered in the developed world and largely forgotten there too, which somehow made it worse. It was a solvable problem that the world had simply declined to solve. HIV was tearing through southern Africa with a brutality that made even the most hardened public health veterans stagger. Polio still paralyzed children in corners of the globe that rarely made the evening news in New York or London. Gates looked at all of this and felt, by his own account, not just sadness but something close to rage, a rational fury at the preventability of it all. This was, it should be said, a man who had spent 2 decades being described as a ruthless competitor, a demanding boss, a person not primarily known for his warmth. And here he was, genuinely undone by mortality statistics from Nigeria. Life is funny that way. The same analytical mind that had once carved up the software market with surgical coldness was now applying itself to the question of why a bed net cost $2 and why that price was still somehow too high for the people who needed it most. The foundation's early years were marked by both enormous ambition and genuine humility. Gates would later admit they got things wrong. There were education initiatives that didn't land the way they hoped, agricultural programs that needed rethinking, assumptions baked in by Western experience that didn't translate cleanly to the realities of rural Bangladesh or sub-Saharan village life. He has spoken about these stumbles with unusual candor for a man of his stature, the kind of candor that comes either from having nothing left to prove or from having too much still at stake to pretend. With Gates, it has probably always been the latter. What the foundation got right, it got right at scale. Funding for malaria prevention and treatment programs helped drive down child mortality in some of the world's most vulnerable regions. Support for polio eradication campaigns pushed the disease to the brink of extinction, a creature that had once paralyzed tens of thousands of children a year, reduced to a handful of cases clinging on in the remotest corners of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Antiretroviral programs helped keep HIV-positive patients alive long enough to watch their own children grow up. These are not press release accomplishments. These are lives, specific and irreducible, continuing instead of ending. There is a particular quality to Gates in this period that doesn't get discussed enough. He was learning, visibly and with evident pleasure, in real time. The man who had once memorized the Seattle phone book for fun had found a new library, and this one had stakes he hadn't quite encountered before. A bug in a software program caused frustration. A flawed health intervention caused deaths. The weight of that difference transformed him in ways that are difficult to articulate but unmistakable in the record. He became more patient in some respects, more willing to sit with complexity, more interested in the slow, difficult work of institutional change rather than the clean elegance of a technical solution. He also got better at asking for help, which for a man whose default mode had long been to already know the answer, was no small evolution. He recruited scientists, economists, and public health experts who had spent their careers in the field and actually listened to what they told him, then challenged them, pushed back, made them defend their assumptions because old habits die on their own schedule. Meetings at the Gates Foundation were not gentle affairs, but they were increasingly pointed in the right direction. By the end of the first decade of the foundation's existence, the numbers were staggering, not in the way that Microsoft's market capitalization was staggering, which had always felt abstract, but staggering in the way that mattered on the ground, where a child in Zambia reached her 5th birthday because a bed net existed between her and the mosquito that might have killed her. Gates didn't personally deliver that net, obviously. But without the funding infrastructure he and Melinda built, the chain of cause and effect that protected her simply would not have existed. The man who had once sold the world a better way to work was now trying, with every instrument available to him, to keep the world alive long enough to use it. Chapter 9: Reckoning and Reinvention. For a long time, Bill Gates had been treated as something close to a natural phenomenon. Not quite a person in the conventional sense, but a force, a system, an outcome. You didn't gossip about tectonic plates. You didn't ask continental drift about its personal life. And so, for decades, the scrutiny directed at Gates had been almost entirely professional. Was he too powerful? Was Microsoft too dominant? Were his foundation's vaccination programs the genuine article, or a billionaire's vanity project dressed in humanitarian clothing? These were fair and sometimes hard questions, but they were questions about the institution of Bill Gates, not the man inside it. Then, in 2021, the man showed up. It started with the divorce. On May 3rd of that year, Bill and Melinda French Gates announced the end of their 27-year marriage in a joint statement that was notably short on warmth and conspicuously free of the words amicable and mutual respect, which every couple in history has used to signal that things were neither amicable nor mutually respectful. The world, which had watched them give away tens of billions of dollars together while appearing to genuinely like each other, was genuinely startled. This was not supposed to happen to them. They were the power couple who had made global health feel, against all odds, slightly aspirational. They had gone to Africa together. They had read the same books. They had matching determination. What emerged in the weeks that followed was messier and more recognizable than anyone who had mythologized them wanted to acknowledge. Reports surfaced that Gates had engaged in an affair with a Microsoft employee years earlier, a relationship the company's board had reportedly investigated in 2019. Gates later confirmed the affair existed, calling it a personal failing and expressing regret in the clipped, precise way that a man more comfortable with data than emotion tends to express regret. It was honest, more or less. It was also more or less not enough for everyone who heard it. There is something almost poignant and a little absurd about a man who had spent 20 years learning the molecular mechanisms of malaria, who could explain vaccine cold chain logistics in regions without reliable electricity, who had restructured his entire existence around the principle of saving strangers' lives, turning out to have fumbled badly the much smaller and more immediate project of being a trustworthy partner to a woman who was standing right next to him. The ambition that burned in Gates had always consumed enormous amounts of fuel. The question that the divorce raised quietly and persistently was who else had been caught in the heat. Melinda, for her part, had clearly been doing a great deal of thinking. She left the Gates Foundation in June 2024, citing her inability to continue working alongside her ex-husband, and walked away with a reported $12.5 billion to pursue her own philanthropic path. She had spent years building the foundation's identity just as surely as he had, and her departure was a reminder that the institution had always been a partnership, whatever the name on the door suggested. Then there was Jeffrey Epstein. If the affair was uncomfortable, the Epstein question was something worse. It was murky, which is almost always more damaging than clean wrongdoing, because murk allows imaginations to fill in whatever shape they like. Gates had met with Epstein multiple times after Epstein's 2008 conviction for soliciting prostitution from a minor, meetings that Gates later acknowledged with visible unease, describing them as mistakes and saying he had hoped Epstein could help facilitate large philanthropic donations. Whether that explanation is entirely complete is a question that has never been definitively answered. What is certain is that Epstein's name, attached to anyone's, functions like a dye dropped in water. It spreads and it stains and it does not come entirely clean, regardless of what the facts actually are. Gates did not handle these revelations with the fluency he brought to explaining epidemiology or energy innovation. He was better with systems than with feelings, better with problems he could quantify than with the kind of damage that resists any spreadsheet. His public apologies had the quality of code that runs correctly without quite feeling right. They were grammatically remorseful without being emotionally generous, and people noticed. He had spent a career being the smartest person in the room. Being the most accountable person in the room turned out to require an entirely different skill. And yet, and this matters, he did not collapse. He did not retreat to one of his enormous properties and go quiet and wait for the news cycle to rotate. The foundation kept its commitments. The money kept flowing. In 2022, Gates pledged an additional $20 billion to the foundation's endowment and declared an intention to give away virtually all of his remaining fortune rather than see it pass to heirs. He continued publishing, continued advocating loudly and in specific technical detail about pandemic preparedness, climate change, and the particular cruelty of diseases that kill children at rates that wealthy countries stopped tolerating generations ago. Whatever was broken in his private life, the engine of his public mission did not sputter. There is a version of this story where that sustained commitment reads as admirable perseverance. There is another version where it reads as a billionaire's best possible refuge from accountability. Throw more money at the world and see if the world blinks first. Both versions are probably partially true, which is the irritating thing about complicated people. They tend to resist the version where one reading cancels the other out. What the reckoning of these years revealed, more than any single scandal, was that the image of Bill Gates as a figure above ordinary human failure had always been a projection, his own as much as the public's. He had worked with extraordinary deliberateness to be taken seriously, to be seen as rigorous, rational, and correct. That effort had paid off handsomely for decades, but the cost of building a self that runs on precision and performance is that when the human parts show through, the reckless parts, the selfish parts, the parts that make bad decisions in private while giving speeches about moral clarity in public, the gap between the image and the reality feels wider than it might for someone who had never worked so hard to close it. He was 65 years old when the divorce was announced. He had outlasted antitrust lawsuits, corporate rivals, and a global pandemic that had, in its early weeks, been widely described using his own decade-old predictions. He had given away more money than most nations produce in a year. He had also, quietly and significantly, hurt people he was supposed to care for. The man who once bet everything on a vision of what computing could become was now asked, by history and by basic human decency, to bet something harder. The willingness to be seen as fallible, accountable, and still worth listening to, not because the scoreboard was perfect, but because the work was real. He was still, unmistakably, in the game. Chapter 10. Legacy in Progress. Here is a strange thing to consider. The same hands that once typed frantic lines of code through the night in Albuquerque, racing to meet a deadline that would either make or break a company no one had heard of, now hold briefing documents about the nitrogen cycles of smallholder farms in sub-Saharan Africa. The same brain that could reportedly spot a bug buried deep inside thousands of lines of software by a developer who had forgotten it was there now absorbs mortality tables, vaccine cold chain logistics, and the particular cruelties of diseases that most wealthy people in the world will never encounter. The biographical arc of Bill Gates is, depending on your disposition, either one of the most inspiring pivots in modern history or the most aggressively overachieving midlife reinvention anyone has ever attempted. Possibly both. What does a legacy look like when the person building it is still very much alive and apparently not planning to stop? Gates today is in his late 60s, and to watch him in interviews is to get the peculiar sense that he has not slowed down so much as he has redirected. The rocking motion he was known for in early Microsoft days, that physical restlessness while thinking, still surfaces occasionally as though his body is running a process his face is too composed to betray. He is more patient now in conversation, more willing to say, "I don't know," or "I got that wrong," and those small admissions are, frankly, more startling coming from him than any grand pronouncement. He built a career on never being the least informed person in the room. Uncertainty does not sit naturally on him, but he is learning to wear it. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, even after the painful and public dissolution of his marriage to Melinda French Gates in 2021, continues to operate at a scale that makes most governments look undercommitted. Billions of dollars have flowed toward malaria prevention, polio eradication campaigns, tuberculosis treatment, and agricultural development for the world's poorest farmers. The polio work alone is a staggering number. The disease that once paralyzed hundreds of thousands of children annually worldwide has been reduced to a vanishingly small number of cases, due in large part to vaccination campaigns the foundation helped fund and coordinate. Gates has said in various forums that he expects polio to be fully eradicated within his lifetime, and when he says it, he does not say it like a wish. He says it like a deadline. He has become, somewhat improbably, a prolific and genuinely readable author. His blog, Gates Notes, which he has kept for years with a consistency that shames most professional writers, covers everything from the books he is currently consuming to detailed explainers on clean energy or pandemic preparedness. He once posted a review of a book about soil. It was not boring. He has also written books on climate change, on pandemic response, on the technologies he believes will shape the next half-century, and they have a quality that is rare in books by very famous, very busy people. They feel like he actually wrote them, and like he actually cared whether you understood. On climate change specifically, Gates has leaned in with a seriousness that some critics found surprising and others found suspicious. He has invested in nuclear energy startups, in companies developing direct air carbon capture, in the unglamorous infrastructure of decarbonization that does not make for exciting press releases. His argument, laid out in characteristically data-first fashion, is essentially that enthusiasm without engineering is just a feeling, and feelings do not reduce atmospheric carbon. It is, depending on your priors, either a bracing corrective or an infuriating deflation of urgency. He tends to generate that split. And then there is the complicated matter of his public reputation, which has never quite settled back into the comfortable shape it once had. The years of revelations about a workplace relationship he has acknowledged was a mistake, about the association with Jeffrey Epstein that he has described as one of his worst errors in judgment, about the private tensions inside his marriage, have made him a more ambiguous public figure than he was during the era when he was simply the unfathomably rich man handing out billions to fight disease. He cannot be fully sanctified, which, honestly, may be a service to everyone. Uncomplicated heroes make for comfortable stories and terrible instruction manuals. What Gates represents, in the long view, is something harder to categorize and therefore more interesting to sit with. He is a case study in what happens when the qualities that make someone extraordinarily successful, relentlessness, intolerance for mediocrity, the conviction that one's own analysis is probably right, are neither purely virtues nor purely flaws but instruments, tools whose moral weight depends entirely on what they are used to build. The same drive that once crushed competitors in the software market is now aimed at the logistics of vaccine distribution in the developing world. The ruthlessness did not disappear. It found a different application. There is something almost funny about the way he has become, of all things, an optimist. Not the soft, inspirational poster kind, but an optimist who will hand you 17 pages of citations and a chart. He genuinely believes that the problems facing humanity, poverty, disease, climate, the terrifying uncertainty of what the next pandemic will look like, are solvable, not because people are good, but because people are ingenious. He has, against considerable evidence to the contrary, retained a faith in human capability that feels almost naive until you remember that a kid who once snuck into a computer lab in the middle of the night to teach himself programming grew up to put that machine in the hands of billions of people. The naivete, at least in his case, has a track record. His daughter Phoebe Gates has spoken publicly and warmly about who her father is in private, and there is something quietly moving about the picture she sketches. A man who brings the same focused intensity to cooking breakfast as to everything else, who is competitive at board games with an enthusiasm that is either charming or alarming depending on whether you are winning. He is, in these accounts, recognizably human in the ways that matter. A parent, a person who has made mistakes and had to look at them, someone who still finds genuine pleasure in learning something he did not know yesterday. The story of Bill Gates does not resolve neatly, and that is precisely its value. It refuses the clean arc, the humble origin, the glorious rise, the graceful exit that we tend to demand of our most prominent figures. Instead, it keeps going, keeps revising, keeps producing new complications and new achievements in roughly equal measure. Somewhere right now, a child in a country Gates may never visit is alive because of a vaccine that would not have reached her without the funding and coordination his foundation provided. Somewhere else, a critic is composing a fair argument about the things he got wrong. Both things are true, and both things are part of the picture, and the picture is still, unmistakably being painted. Legends are rarely born ready. They are shaped by mistakes, risk, and persistence. Subscribe for the next story. We are just getting started.